Hello students, it's Dr. Yu. We're in the final part of this video lecture series on making PowerPoints, where we're going to focus on synchronization. Now, here's the overview that we've covered so far. We first focused on how to design to grab attention with layout and our design and thematization overall. Then we looked at creating glance media, and then now we're on to synchronizing the presentation. Now, when we synchronize the presentation, what exactly do we mean? Well, let me give you a preview. We're going to answer exactly that, as well as what are the types of animations, because that's going to go in hand with the idea of synchronization. We'll also look at transitions too, because transitions are a type of animation, but special because they're in between slides. And then we'll also look at how you deploy long quote slides as well, and how you display sources, and the use of leave-behinds to ensure your PowerPoint presentation is fully synchronized. So, what is synchronization? Well, let me give you an example. This is a static slide. A lot of times when people present on PowerPoint, they deploy nothing but static slides, where it shows all of the content at once, and so the audience is just going to start reading ahead of the slide. And then, as they read ahead of the slide, they stop listening to the presenter. Because remember, we talk about the idea of not wanting to divide our audience's attention. And remember, in data visualization, we want to keep the audience focused on one thing. So when you deploy a bunch of static slides like this, the slide gets ahead of you. And now you've probably been waiting for a bit now for me to move on to the next slide. Now, one principle that we want to make sure we emphasize as we do PowerPoint and as we present with PowerPoint is you never divide your audience's attention. When you show a static slide like that I showed before, and then you try to talk at the same time, the audience has to choose between either reading or listening to you. They're not going to be able to do both very well. Either they're not going to read well or they're not going to listen to you well. Either way, that's bad, because chances are the things that you're saying are important. And what you've written on the slide might be important, maybe not, but still, you don't want to make them choose because you're going to lose your audience overall. So we don't want to divide our audience's attention. Now, there is a little bit of a smarter way to present slides, because maybe you want to show a lot of things, but you don't want to obviously show it as a static slide where it's all showing at once and the audience is confused. Well, I want to introduce to you the idea of a progressive slide. What I love about a progressive slide is it doesn't show everything all at once, and it maintains the novelty of the presentation. The novelty being you're not able to predict what I'm going to be able to do next with this progressive slide. With the static slide, I give away everything, and then you just kind of read ahead and just kind of tune out the speaker because you've already read everything. Here's what I like about the progressive slide. What am I going to show next? Do you know what's coming next? Well, here's what's coming next. We're going to have a picture of a dog. Right? We all like dogs, the little puppy. Oh, look at on the sofa there. Okay, what's coming next? Do you know? Can you guess? What's coming next on this slide? Oh, how about more puppies? Okay, so now we got 2 in a basket. It's adorable, and we love looking at puppies. Now, can you decide do you know what's coming third? Can you tell me what's going to come third? Is it going to be more dogs? Is it going to be something else? Well, how about this? We got a cat. So all our cat lovers in here, the cat comes in and takes over the slide. So that's a progressive slide. It doesn't show everything at once, but it shows it over time when I'm ready to show it. Now, I'm not saying that static slides are always bad. I don't want you to think that you should never use static slides then. For example, this picture of a wolf is a static slide, and there's nothing that's going to be added to it. Maybe I'm trying to make a point about wolves or wolf safety, or we're like a wolf and we're on the prowl or so forth. Okay, there's nothing wrong with a static slide in this case because you're just looking at a picture of a wolf and you're not reading anything. So you can look at a picture of a wolf and still listen to me talk and give you oral information. And even something like this isn't bad either. If you just have one sentence on the slide, just one quick thesis sentence at the top, and when I present this picture, say, we are on the prowl to profits, if I say that, and then you have the picture of the wolf, and then I explain how we're on the prowl to profits, then that's probably okay too, because I said the sentence really fast. It's a very short sentence. It's only 7 words, right? Yeah, 7 words. And that's it. I don't have full paragraphs of text that I'm showing up here. So this is manageable. This is a manageable static slide. Anything longer than this, though, in terms of text would probably be too much. What we just don't want to do is this. We don't want to have a static slide like this, where it's all text, it's showing all the content at once, and I'm just trying to get through each of the bullet points, even though you've already read ahead of me multiple times. If you want to keep the audience's attention and you don't want to make yourself superfluous as a presenter, then here's what you need to do if you're going to do a static slide like that, where you have to maybe show every bullet point like that. Just show one at a time. And then when you're ready for the next bullet point, hit next. And then when you're ready for the next one, next. And when you're ready for the next one, next. Now, to do things like static slides and progressive slides, you have to know how to use animations. Because overall, a progressive slide is just a deployment of animations. Now, there are 3 types of animations that you can do in PowerPoint. First, you have entrance animations. And so this is an animation that makes something appear that wasn't there before. So your progressive slide is the use of an entrance animation. The text wasn't there initially, but now it appears at a specific time that you want it to appear. You also have path animations. Path animations move objects or elements on a slide to another part of the slide to demonstrate something. You would use a path animation perhaps in a bar or a graph, or like in a chart to show movement or a progression of something. We won't go into much detail about path animations in this lecture just for the sake of time. But the other type of animations I do want you to be familiar with. Entrance for sure, but lastly, exit animations, making things disappear. Exit animations are going to be useful when you want to do something like a progressive table, or something where you can't piece the thing apart, so you have to show it all at once, but you don't want the audience to look at the thing all at once. You only want them to look at specific parts. So there you would use an exit animation. Let me give you an example. Here's where an exit animation makes a lot of sense to use. So let's say I want to do a progressive table. So I want to display a table in my PowerPoint, and it's very possible that you might have to do this, and especially if you're presenting accounting information or anything like that. The problem is, as far as I know, and I've looked, I've tried to YouTube it, I've Googled it, there's not an easy way to just make a progressive table on PowerPoint, at least natively, I would say. There's not really a setting, even when you try to animate the table, it still shows the table all at once. So what I figured out, as far as making tables progressive, is I just use exit animations with a shape tool. So right now this slide looks blank, but actually there's already a table on the slide. It's just camouflaged by some shape tools that I just camouflaged with the background color. So when I'm ready to show the table, here's what's going to happen. One of the shapes are going to disappear. So I have the top of the table here. And then when I want to talk about company A, I'll just have the second shape leave. So now I'm on company A. And then when I'm done talking about company A's profit and loss, I'll talk about company B. So literally this was 3 shapes that just were camouflaged to match the background. And then all I did was just do some exit animations to make the shape. So shape 1 was here, shape 2 was here, shape 3 was here. And then I just made them disappear. And that's how you can do a progressive table. So these are the cases where an exit animation, at least that's when I use one, is when I want something to disappear to cover something, or I just don't want something to be in the audience's attention anymore, and I want them to go back to focusing on something else on the slide. Now, to do these kinds of slides, if you're thinking about this from a presentation standpoint, you're probably going to need a clicker, because unless you're trapped behind the keyboard or the laptop or wherever the computer is, if you want to be able to move around the room and to run these progressive slides, because everything should be on click, I would never use timed animations, because if you ever fall behind on your timings, it's going to mess up your whole presentation. So I always do it on click. If you have a clicker, then you don't have to keep running back and forth between the computer and where you were standing. The clicker makes it very easy to run those animations. So that's why every professional presenter and Even myself, I carry a clicker in every bag because if I present, I'm going to need one of those if I'm presenting with PowerPoint. If I'm not presenting with PowerPoint, then of course I don't need one. Next, I want to talk about another type of animation, which are transitions. Now, I like transitions because, number one, they help create a nice flow between slides. You saw that? So this is a specific transition that I'm using, and it's called morph. So when you go to transitions up here, you just pick morph, and then you get this nice little, like, it morphs the slide into the next one, and then it adds some continuity and woo to it, okay? But that's not the only reason why I like transitions. So it's not just transitions to create a woo effect. Transitions actually can be useful for showing continuity between slides or ideas. Let me give you an example. Let's say I'm showing a timeline here, and just a very simple timeline, and let's just say on March 25th, 2019, event 1 happened, and then on December 14, 2019, event 2 happened. Now, let's say I have 4 more events I want to show on the timeline, but I just don't have enough space on the slide. Notice how the timeline cuts out into the gutter here, and I want it to go into the far right. By using a transition push right, you see that? It makes the timeline look continuous because the transition will naturally connect the 2 slides, and then now it looks like I have one long slide going together. And then see, you have event 3, event 4, and today. And so that's the power of transitions. It can create continuity and sort of paths in your PowerPoint so you can see how the PowerPoint progresses physically as you look at the slides. So something to think about for sure when you want to deploy transitions. Now, how do you deploy long quote slides? I'm sure this is a question now that some of my law students perhaps are wondering. What if I have to show law? Obviously, you're not going to visualize law. Like, you're not going to like visualize the Fourth Amendment with a lock and key and then like somebody in their house, like, no, police, something like that. Like, no, when you have to show law, you have to show the text verbatim, right? These, even like commas and like one word can change the total meaning of the law. So you got to show that stuff. Or maybe you have to show company policy and you have to show company policy very verbatimly. Okay. So yes, in those cases, you have to deploy a long quote slide. Now, one of your options, of course, is to show it as a progressive slide, but let's say you have to show the text all at once. Here are 3 different techniques that you can use to deploy a long quote slide. The first technique is I'm going to give you a minute to read this. Go ahead and read it. So, this is one technique. If you need to show something all at once, or it's text, or let's say you have this complicated diagram and you can't make it progressive, then just put the slide on the screen and then just say, audience, I'll give you 30 seconds to read this, or I'll give you 30 seconds to look at this. And then just take the silence. There's nothing wrong with silence in a presentation, especially if you're letting the audience have the opportunity to digest information. This is where the whole idea of feeding a child comes back into play. You got to let them chew and let them swallow. If you're giving them a big chunk of food, or in this case, a big chunk of information, you got to give them time to digest it, or in this case, process the information. Silence is a great way to do that. But let's say you don't want to do that. You don't like silence or whatever. You think there's too much time, not enough time. Okay. Well, here's option 2. Other times, the best thing to do is just read to your audience. That way your audience does not have to choose between listening to you and reading your text because you're doing both at the same time, if you synchronize the text and recitation. Not only does it keep their attention, but then the text becomes part of your presentation and your following arguments will make more sense. You should use this option sparingly. So, there just may be moments in the presentation. It shouldn't be the whole presentation, but just maybe that one particular moment where perhaps the best option is just to read to my audience, just for that slide, just for that moment. And I think in that case, your audience will be understanding and forgiving because probably in that moment, if you had to read the text, it was probably for a very important reason. What we just don't want is every slide being like that. But you have a third option as well. And this one is good because you can get the audience involved, which is some volunteers. So if I had 3 volunteers here, I would ask somebody to read the first part. So I would have somebody say, when you ask people in the audience to read the slide for you, it solves 2 problems. And then I might say, okay, somebody else. First, it keeps the audience engaged since you're making them part of the presentation. And then I might say, okay, somebody else. Second, it gets your long quote slide read. Okay, yes, good. So you can get somebody else to read the slide for you. Have a volunteer read it. Then at least somebody's getting involved and your long quote slide is getting read. And then I've seen students get really creative with this. Some students, when I had them do persuasive presentations where they had to show a 2-sided argument, 2-sided meaning they had to show the pro and the con, they would have one person read the pro and one person read the con. And they would just get different volunteers. Great way to get people involved. And depending on who you're presenting to, this could be an option as well. The next thing is, how do you cite sources? This often comes up in academic presentations, but also in business presentations where you have to show where you got your numbers or where you got your data from. It's important to know how to cite sources effectively in a PowerPoint presentation. Now, I call this the garbage references slide. I call it garbage not because the references themselves are garbage necessarily, but because, you know, in football, like in the 4th quarter when one team is winning by a lot and there's about 5 minutes left, and so the team stop trying essentially and they just try to run out the clock because they know they've lost, so now they're just trying to run the clock out and move on to the next game. And we call that garbage time. A lot of times when I see references slide in presentations, the references slide doesn't come up until either the very end, right before the person concludes, and then the person just kind of speeds through it real fast. They'll say, here are my sources. Or it'll come after we've applauded the person, and then the person shows their references slide, and then once again they speed through it and then they sit down. In both cases, we don't really get a chance to really look at the references. I feel like we're not given enough time because references could take up several slides, and then you have to ask them to go back or you have to go forward. It's just not a good way to do references. On a paper, yes. When we're just doing a paper and we're handing it to somebody to read, this is a great way to do references. But for a PowerPoint where you have the issue of projection and temporality, this is not a good way to do references. So here's how I recommend you do references. Let's just say I'm presenting a slide on Grice's maxims. It's the communication philosopher. Okay. Anyway, ignoring the concepts here, notice what I did here. I put the source at the bottom of the slide. So what happens is I'll be talking about Grice's maxims, and there's different ways to present this slide. So I could say, according to Herbert Paul Grice's logic and conversation, Grice came up with 4 maxims: quantity, quality, relation, and manner. Okay, so then right when I say according to Herbert Paul Grice's logic and conversation, I can make this appear, and then people can look at it as I cite the source, and then it's doing 2 things. Number 1, it's serving as a memory aid as I cite this, so that way I don't have to remember every person's book and citation and so forth. But secondly, as I go through Grice, the audience can look at this source and have plenty of time with it. However long I spend on this slide is however long they get to look at this and really just glance at it, and then go back to looking at the presentation. Now, if you're worried about dividing the audience's attention, you can always time when this appears. You could even show the slide, and then at the end of the slide before you move on, just show them this source, and then move on to the next slide. But then you might be wondering, well, if you show it at the end of the slide, like when you're about to move on, wouldn't that only give them 3 to 5 seconds? Yes, but here's how it's different. If you do all your slides at the end of the or if you do all of your sources at the end of the presentation and do that whole, here are my sources real fast, you're giving the audience 3 to 5 seconds to read 5 to 10 different sources. So that's like half a second per source. If I give you 3 to 5 seconds at the end of one slide to just look at one source, I'm giving you 3 to 5 seconds to look at one source. Which one is more preferable? Probably just getting 3 to 5 seconds to look at one source versus 3 to 5 seconds to look at 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, 20 sources. So that's still comparatively better than before. So you have options there. You can figure out how you want to synchronize the coming of the citation and your slide and where its placement is, but that's what I recommend, is citing as you go rather than citing at the end. Now, let's talk about leave behinds. What are leave behinds? Sometimes you're going to give presentations and you want to have something to give the audience afterwards. And this might be for two reasons. Number one, maybe people are going to miss the presentation, and so you want to give them something that they can look at afterwards that can get them up to speed on what they missed. Or sometimes you want to help reinforce some information that you gave. Like maybe you gave some really important information and you want the audience to remember it with some kind of concrete thing that they can hold on to. So a leave behind is great. Now, this is an example of what you think a leave behind would be. Well, why don't I just print out the slides in note form and all that stuff? I mean, you could do this, but the problem is, like this slide deck that I have here is 110 slides, something like 90 something slides. So imagine how many pages this thing would be. And then some of the slides, as you would recall, are photos, and then some are preview slides. I mean, so something like this would be really hard to go through and really get the point. Now, what I recommend, instead of just giving people your notes slides, if you will, or something like this, is to make something graphic. Like here, you can do like a little dashboard perhaps. And this is something you have to make separately, of course, but you can make a little dashboard that just has all the key points of the slide in one little page and some of the key graphics from the slide. And then you can hand this to people. And then if they missed out, well, this is kind of what they missed out on. But if they also just want to be reinforced with memory, you can also use this as well. You can also use leave behinds to provide additional details for information that you might have left off the slide. So let's say you're presenting on something technical and you just decided, just for easy presentation, I left off some important detail, some not important, but just like, so left off some details. And in case if people want those details, they can look at it in the leave behind. So if they want to know something very specific, some technical thing, okay, in this leave behind that I made, here is such and such. So that's what a leave behind can also do. It can be used to compensate for things you left off the slides in case people need it, but you don't think is that important to show in the moment of the presentation. Sometimes you only have 5 minutes or 10 minutes, so you have to make decisions as to what's important and what's not important, or at least is less important for the presentation segment. But you've also seen me do stuff. If you remember from the public speaking overview, I made you a leave behind for the speech sandwich. This is something I made on Canva. Everything else that I've made in this slide deck has been made on PowerPoint, but the leave behinds I have to make outside. But everything else I've shown you has been made on PowerPoint. Also, this one for the data visualization part, at least the quantitative visualization. This is another leave behind I made. So the idea is that it conveys kind of the main points just in a very quick way. Now, can you just look at the leave behind and completely understand everything I went through in those slides? No, but it at least gives you kind of a gist. So you would still need to watch the data visualization lectures to understand everything, because you may not understand, what do you mean eliminate? What do you mean highlight? You know, those kinds of things. So yeah, it's not meant to replace you, but it's just meant to reinforce you, is what a leave behind is. But then technically we can talk about leave aheads. So a leave ahead would be something that you give the audience before you present. So this would be like days, weeks, months before your presentation, or maybe hours. And in those cases, the audience would have had time to read through everything that you have left ahead. And then when you're giving the presentation, you're already assuming that they have read or saw or viewed the thing that you gave them. And then the presentation's just more visual and oral reinforcement. An example of a leave ahead is perhaps you're giving a capstone presentation where you have to submit a report to the audience first, like, days, weeks, months in advance. The audience reads the report, and then you give a presentation on the report on the day of your capstone. And then you have to defend or whatever your report and all that. Well, you already have the leave ahead of your report, so that will impact what you probably should and shouldn't present in the actual presentation, because the audience does have some of those details. And if they ask for a specific detail that is in your report during your presentation, you can always reference them back to the report. So overall, we looked at 6 different things here. We looked at what synchronization is. Synchronization is the timing of your slide deck and your presentation together. Just like music, where the lyrics and the song or the music itself have to be in sync. Like the lyrics can't get ahead of the music and the music can't get ahead of the lyrics. Your PowerPoint has to be in synchronization, has to be in sync with you, the presenter. We looked at different types of animations, entrance, path, and exit, as well as transitions, which are like a form of animation. We also dealt with the issue of long quote slides, so all my law students and HR people and lawmakers, this is how you would show slides like those. We also talked about how you display sources, so at the bottom of the slide, don't do the garbage references slide. And lastly, what are leave behinds and technically leave aheads. So with all of this information, I hope you can present like Steve Jobs, all of you. He does great PowerPoints. I love his iPhone reveal and his MacBook Air reveal. You should watch those on YouTube if you want to see good PowerPoint and audience engagement, especially the MacBook Air one is really good on that front. And I just hope you all become good presenters. And by the way, before I go, what was that picture that I told you to remember? Ah, yes, the rainbow.